When we look back at American history, we often find stories of families built on hard work, faith, and legacy. But hidden within those same timelines are lineages steeped in madness, cruelty, and unspeakable acts. Some names were whispered in fear, never written in records, yet remembered in the nightmares of those who lived nearby. One such family lived deep in the heart of Alabama, where darkness took root in their bloodline. Their story was not of survival, but of inherited insanity. It had already been whispered about for years. Stories swirled about their children born with strange fits of delirium, about mothers who walked barefoot into the woods and returned days later with wild eyes, and about men whose tempers snapped like brittle twigs, leaving bloodshed in their wake. Whether or not every detail was true mattered little, because in Alabama at that time, rumor and reputation could become as real as fact, shaping how a family was seen, how they were treated, and how history remembered them. But within the walls of the Crowhaven home, reality and rumor were almost indistinguishable, for the family themselves seemed to embody both. Their lineage was marked by instability, each generation carrying forth traits that whispered of something more than mere human failing, as if their very blood carried the weight of corruption. The year itself bore witness to their decline, for it was during this time that the family seemed to unravel in full view of those who dared come near. The children of that generation, pale and sickly, were said to wander aimlessly, speaking to things unseen, their words a mixture of scripture and madness. Their matriarch, an aging woman with hollow cheeks and eyes that never rested, was seen standing in the fields long after midnight, staring into the trees as if awaiting something unspeakable. The men, rough-handed from farm work, grew more violent, more unpredictable, their wrath spilling over into acts that left animals slaughtered without reason and neighbors wary of even crossing their path. The Crowhavens were a family that did not merely carry the taint of rumor, they embodied it, living day by day in ways that only confirmed what their community already suspected. In the broader sweep of Alabama's history, 1899 was not marked by the Crowhavens in any official ledger. They were not politicians, nor land barons, nor soldiers of note. They were shadows, their story passed orally from one generation to the next. But sometimes, it is the shadows that tell us the most about an era, for while towns recorded births, marriages, and deaths, the forests and forgotten farms bore witness to the unrecorded truths of families who lived and died in silence. The Crowhavens belonged to that silence, a lineage whose legacy was not written in books, but etched into the fears of those who lived within hearing of their cries. There is something profoundly haunting about the idea of a family line steeped not in greatness or resilience, but in decay. The Crowhavens seemed to live under a kind of curse, one not necessarily supernatural, but no less terrifying. Madness passed from parent to child, violence folded into daily life, secrecy binding them together as the world outside grew smaller and more suspicious. In a time when families often depended on their name and reputation to secure marriages, alliances, or respect in their communities, the Crowhaven name was a burden, a brand of shame and horror that only deepened with each generation. To carry that name in 1899 was to carry with it the weight of countless whispers, of doors closed when you walked by, of prayers muttered under breath when your shadow touched another's land. The Alabama landscape only heightened the terror, for there is something about the rural South that seems to preserve silence and shadow better than most places. The sprawling fields by day carried an endless emptiness, and by night the forests pressed close, suffocating, filled with unseen movements and the cries of nocturnal creatures. Within such an environment, the line between what was real and what was imagined blurred. And for the Crowhavens, who already teetered on the edge of sanity, the land itself seemed complicit, feeding their isolation, feeding their madness, and allowing them to become a living legend of depravity long before the century turned over into the modern world. The story of the Crowhavens is not just one of individuals, but of inheritance. Families at that time often spoke proudly of what they passed down, the land, the tools, the values that guided them. For the Crowhavens, what was passed down was something darker, an inheritance of instability, of fractured minds, of tempers left unchecked, and desires twisted into cruelty. By 1899, their lineage was less a family and more a cycle, a repeating echo of despair that grew louder with each birth and death on their land. To those who lived nearby, the Crowhaven estate was not merely a house. It was a warning, A reminder that not every legacy is worth preserving, and that sometimes the bloodline itself is the curse. The Crowhaven family had never been remembered for honor or respectability, and by the closing years of the 19th century their name had already become something of a ghost that haunted conversations in hushed corners of Alabama's countryside. In small towns and villages, families clung to their legacies with pride, tracing their lineages back to war heroes, pioneers, or men who had carved prosperity from the soil. Yet when the Crowhavens were mentioned, it was rarely in daylight, and almost never in a tone of admiration. Their reputation was not built on strength, resilience, or community, but rather on the lingering stench of madness, cruelty, and perversion that seemed to seep from one generation to the next. Where other families worked tirelessly to build a name that would protect their children in the years to come, the Crowhavens appeared cursed to inherit only shame, whispers, and the suspicion of those who lived around them. From their earliest beginnings in the Alabama wilderness, the Crowhavens carried with them an air of strangeness that unsettled neighbors. They were never a family to involve themselves in community matters, never eager to attend church gatherings or social functions, preferring instead to retreat into their own isolated world. The more they withdrew, the more the outside world filled in the gaps with speculation. People spoke of their strange rituals on Sundays when other families filled pews, of the sickly pallor of their children, and of arguments that spilled out into violence loud enough to carry across the hills at night. These stories grew in power as they passed from one mouth to another, until eventually the name Crowhaven itself became synonymous with something rotten. A name that should have been a banner of identity became instead a shroud of fear and shame. Children in nearby towns were told not to wander near the old Crowhaven homestead, for it was said the family's madness had a way of spreading, of clinging to anyone foolish enough to draw too close. Young girls were warned never to accept the attentions of a Crowhaven suitor, no matter how desperate their circumstances, for a marriage into that bloodline meant inheriting not stability, but ruin. Even merchants grew hesitant to deal with them, whispering that the coins they offered in trade were tainted, as if the depravity of the family could infect even money. Such fears may sound exaggerated to the modern ear, but in 1899 Alabama, where superstition and belief were intertwined with everyday life, these suspicions carried weight. Reputation was as real as land, and once tarnished, it stained every child born into that family forever. The strange thing was that the Crowhavens themselves did little to dispel the darkness surrounding their name. In fact, their behavior often seemed to confirm what others already suspected. It was said that their patriarchs drank heavily, that they beat their wives and children with little provocation, and that the women of the family often sank into fits of melancholy that left them wandering the fields barefoot at night. A child's scream might pierce the night air, followed by the sound of breaking wood, and those who heard it would clutch their crosses and murmur prayers, but never dare to intervene. Over the decades, these incidents accumulated until they became inseparable from the identity of the family itself. Depravity had become their legacy, and no one could remember a Crowhaven who had ever broken free of it. In the world outside their decaying estate, Alabama was slowly changing. Railroads were pushing deeper into the countryside, bringing with them new opportunities and new ways of life. Towns were growing, churches were expanding, and communities were pulling together to adapt to the changing times. Yet the Crowhavens seemed frozen, untouched by progress, bound by an older, darker rhythm that set them apart from their neighbors. Where others embraced the future, the Crowhavens seemed chained to a past that was always heavy with cruelty and instability. The family itself became a kind of relic, a reminder of how far humanity could sink when left to rot in its own isolation. This reputation, whispered and feared, became a cage for the younger generations. A Crowhaven child could not escape the sins of their fathers and mothers. Teachers kept watchful eyes on them, waiting for signs of the madness that always seemed to come, while other children avoided them entirely, fearful that their curse was contagious. The boys grew into men with tempers like wildfire, and the girls into women marked by sorrow and brokenness, their futures already ruined by the name they carried. It was as if the very soil of the Crowhaven land bore poison, nurturing nothing but despair. In this way, the lineage of the Crowhavens became not only depraved, but self-perpetuating. The more they were feared and ostracized, the deeper they sank into their own darkness. The more they embraced violence and secrecy, the more the outside world confirmed its worst suspicions about them. A cycle was born, one that ensured their family would never be remembered with kindness or honor, only with horror and revulsion. The name Crowhaven did not signify heritage in the sense of strength or tradition, but rather a curse carried through the blood. By the time 1899 drew to its close, this reputation had hardened into something unshakable, something eternal, making the Crowhaven name one of the darkest legacies in Alabama's history. Their children were said to inherit more than land, for what passed from parent to child in the Crowhaven family was not wealth, not wisdom, and not even the kind of stubborn resilience so many Southern families prided themselves on. Instead, what was passed down was something unseen yet undeniable, a sickness of the mind and spirit that seemed to grow more potent with each new generation. While other families spoke proudly of their legacies, tracing ancestry back to honored soldiers or respected pioneers, the Crowhavens bore a legacy of darkness that clung to them like a shadow, one that no amount of toil or prayer could wash away. It was whispered that the curse of the Crowhavens lay not in the soil they worked, but in the blood that ran through their veins, twisting their minds toward cruelty, feeding a hunger for violence, and driving them into fits of delirium that terrified both kin and neighbor alike. From the outside, it appeared as if madness itself was etched into their inheritance. Grandfathers who had raged at unseen figures in their final days left behind sons who grew up quick to anger, their wrath spilling into drunken brawls and merciless beatings. Mothers who collapsed into long spells of melancholy raised daughters who spoke in disjointed phrases, who wandered barefoot into the woods to chant strange prayers beneath the moonlight. Children born into the family rarely knew peace, for they grew up surrounded not by love and guidance, but by the echoes of shrieking arguments, slammed doors, and the steady thud of fists striking flesh. Those children in turn became adults who repeated the very same patterns, almost as if the Crowhaven lineage had become a wheel that spun endlessly in the same dark circle, crushing hope beneath its weight. By 1899, the cycle had become so well established that it was spoken of as fact, not superstition. Neighbors claimed they could spot a Crowhaven child instantly by the hollow look in their eyes, by the nervous twitches of their hands, or by the way they seemed to carry an unnatural heaviness about them, as though they were already burdened by sins not yet committed. Farmers who lived nearby claimed that the Crowhaven children could never hold down honest work, for their tempers were too wild, their minds too easily distracted by impulses that led them into destruction. Local women whispered that no matter how fair a Crowhaven daughter might look on the outside, her beauty would eventually fade into the same hollow madness that consumed her mother and grandmother before her. To be born a Crowhaven was to be born with a mark, a stain invisible to the eye yet present in every action, every word, every breath. It was not uncommon in those years for families to suffer from illnesses of the body or mind. But what made the Crowhavens different was how consistently their children seemed to inherit not health, but sickness, not sanity, but delirium. It was as though their very bloodline was poisoned, ensuring that each new generation carried the same flaws, the same tendencies toward cruelty and disorder. Some in Alabama speculated that the family had been cursed generations earlier, perhaps by an old act of betrayal or some forgotten sin that invited damnation upon their name. Others believed that years of inbreeding and isolation had weakened their blood, amplifying instability until it became impossible to ignore. Still others thought the Crowhavens willingly embraced darkness, that their depravity was not the product of a curse but a choice, made again and again until it became tradition. Whatever the cause, the effect was undeniable. The Crowhavens became a family not of individuals but of repetitions, each child doomed to mirror the faults of the ones who came before. This made them both feared and pitied, for while neighbors spoke of them in tones of revulsion, they also could not help but feel a chill of sorrow at the thought of a child born into such a fate, a life already mapped out before it even began. The sound of a Crowhaven infant's cry was not greeted with joy, but with dread, for it was heard as the beginning of yet another cycle of madness and violence that would stretch on for years to come. Their inheritance was a cruel one, for it left no room for escape. A Crowhaven who wished to break free of the curse of their bloodline found themselves pulled back again and again, whether by the weight of expectation, the scorn of outsiders, or the undeniable stirrings of madness within their own minds. The legacy of depravity had grown so strong by the end of the 19th century that it no longer needed rumor to sustain it. It lived in the family itself, in the pale faces of their children, in the shouts that spilled across their land, in the broken spirits of women and the violent hands of men. This inheritance was their true property, more enduring than their failing farm, more binding than any earthly debt, and it clung to them with a grip that no Crowhaven had ever managed to loosen. Where insanity prevailed was not merely a phrase whispered by frightened neighbors, but a reality that seemed to govern every corner of the Crowhaven existence. For by the final years of the 19th century, the family no longer lived as others did, bound by reason or guided by community, but instead existed in a state where madness became the unchallenged ruler of their lives. In most homes across Alabama during that time, routine was what sustained families. Men toiling in the fields, women tending to the household, children learning from parents and schools alike. But within the Crowhaven homestead, routine dissolved into chaos, and what remained was a rhythm of delirium that no outside influence could correct. Their home became a theater of instability, where reality and delusion merged until it was impossible to distinguish one from the other, and every generation sank deeper into the abyss of their own unraveling minds. Neighbors who ventured close enough to the Crowhaven land claimed they could hear strange chants drifting on the night air, sometimes accompanied by the sound of weeping, sometimes by manic laughter that rose and fell like the cries of wild animals. These noises were not confined to isolated incidents but became an almost nightly occurrence, convincing many that the family had surrendered their minds entirely to forces they could not control. The children muttered to unseen companions, their words a jumble of scripture twisted with blasphemy, while the elders of the family spoke in riddles, insisting they had visions that revealed secrets hidden from ordinary men. This environment of perpetual madness created a household where insanity was not treated as affliction, but accepted as inheritance, shaping every action, every ritual, every interaction with the outside world. The line between faith and delusion was especially thin in the Crowhaven household. Alabama in 1899 was a land steeped in religion, where revivals were common and sermons thundered from pulpits about sin and salvation. But the Crowhavens twisted such teachings into something grotesque, blending scripture with hallucination until their prayers sounded more like curses and their practices more like rituals of the damned. Stories circulated that they held midnight gatherings where verses were read aloud in frenzied tones accompanied by the sacrifice of animals, as though they believed madness itself was a form of communion. Their neighbors, horrified by such accounts, avoided the family with growing intensity, but avoidance did not silence the fear, for the screams and chants carried across the fields, serving as constant reminders that the Crowhavens lived under the dominion of something not entirely human. Inside the walls of their home, disorder reigned. Furniture was broken and left unrepaired, windows shattered and covered only by cloth, floors stained with both neglect and violence. The household bore not the marks of poverty alone, but of minds incapable of sustaining order. Meals were irregular, often consisting of scraps eaten at odd hours, and children were left to wander unsupervised, their faces smeared with dirt, their eyes heavy with sleeplessness. Visitors who dared step onto the property described the overwhelming sense of suffocation, as though the very air in the house carried with it the residue of generations of broken minds. It was a dwelling where sanity found no foothold, where rational thought could not survive, and where every object seemed touched by the contagion of despair. The men of the Crowhaven line were particularly feared for the way insanity expressed itself through violence. Quick tempers erupted into brutal acts, often inflicted upon their own kin, yet never spoken of outside the family's walls. Neighbors occasionally stumbled upon the aftermath. An animal mutilated, a child with unexplained bruises, a wife walking with a limp she refused to explain. But these glimpses only deepened the conviction that insanity had taken root in their blood. The women, though often seen as victims of this cycle, were not untouched by the madness. Some succumbed to prolonged silences, sitting for hours staring blankly into space, while others broke into fits of shrieking that carried across the night, voices so piercing that neighbors swore they could feel the sound in their bones. The children grew up in this environment, absorbing the chaos as though it were the only natural way of life. They imitated their parents' outbursts, screamed at unseen figures, and carried forward the rituals of delirium they witnessed. Outsiders, watching from a distance, realized with dread that the insanity of the Crowhavens was not only a condition of the present generation, but a guarantee for the future. Each child seemed to step seamlessly into the role their parents had carved, ensuring that the family remained trapped in an endless cycle where insanity was both the foundation and the inheritance. The broader community could do little but watch in horror, for though whispers of intervention were occasionally raised, no one was willing to step foot on Crowhaven land with the intent of reform or rescue. Fear outweighed compassion, and superstition held stronger sway than duty. It was believed that the madness of the Crowhavens was not a condition to be cured, but a contagion to be avoided, and so the family was left alone in their crumbling estate, free to continue their descent. This isolation only deepened their detachment from reality until their name became inseparable from insanity itself, a cautionary tale passed on through whispers, warning children and grandchildren never to stray too close to the land where the Crowhavens lived. By the end of the century, their reputation had hardened into legend, and to speak of them was to speak of insanity as though it were not an illness but a sovereign power that claimed dominion over a family, shaping them, consuming them, and binding them inescapably to a legacy of horror. The memory of the Crowhavens did not live on in official records, for no town clerk bothered to preserve the accounts of their daily lives, and no church ledger held neat lines of their names etched in ink. But their story endured nonetheless in the voices of those who whispered about them long after the last of their homestead collapsed into ruin. This was history preserved not in books, but in fear, carried by the oral traditions of neighbors, by the murmurs of travelers who passed through Alabama, and by the campfire tales meant to frighten children into obedience. The Crowhavens were not remembered for what they built or contributed, but for the way they unsettled all who encountered them, for the terror they inspired, and for the long shadow they left over the land they once occupied. In this way, their story became both history and horror, inseparable from the soil itself, a lingering mark that resisted the erasure of time. Local storytellers described their land as cursed, claiming that crops grew stunted and that animals who wandered too close to the boundaries often sickened or vanished altogether. Even after the last of the family had perished, the ruins of their estate drew wary glances from those who passed by. Hunters refused to track game across their property, and farmers warned their children never to step onto the soil for fear that the madness of the Crowhavens might seep through their shoes and into their blood. Over time, what began as rumor hardened into folklore, and the Crowhavens themselves transformed into something more than human in the collective memory of Alabama's backwoods. They became symbols of corruption, their family name invoked whenever strange noises echoed through the night, or when tragedy struck a neighboring farm without explanation. The horrors attributed to them grew with each retelling, as stories do, but beneath the embellishments lay the core truth that the family had lived in a state of degradation and insanity that left scars on the land and on those who remembered them. Neighbors swore they heard screams coming from the estate long after it was abandoned, as if the echoes of past violence had been imprinted on the walls themselves. Others told of seeing figures moving in the windows of the collapsed homestead, pale faces staring out into the night, vanishing as soon as they were noticed. These tales ensured that the Crowhavens would never truly die, for even their absence seemed haunted, their legacy too heavy to be buried. The most enduring stories were always tied to the lineage itself, to the way their blood seemed poisoned, carrying depravity and madness through each generation, as though it were an inheritance more binding than land or wealth. In Alabama's rural communities, where ancestry was a point of pride and where surnames carried weight, the Crowhaven name became a warning, proof that not all legacies were worth cherishing. While other families traced their roots with pride, recounting tales of forefathers who fought in wars or carved farms out of wilderness, the Crowhavens were remembered as a lineage that should never have been allowed to continue. Theirs was not a story of survival, but of contagion, a cycle of instability and cruelty that defied the natural hope that children might outgrow the sins of their parents. By 1899, the tale of the Crowhavens had already slipped into the realm of legend, their depravity retold with the same weight as ghost stories and cautionary fables. But unlike fiction, their story carried the chilling certainty that they had been real, that the family had walked the very roads and fields that others still used, and that their screams had once carried across the night air in living memory. This intersection of fact and fear gave the story its enduring power, for the Crowhavens were not distant figures imagined for entertainment, but flesh and blood people whose lives had embodied everything that the community most feared. They were a testament to the belief that evil could take root in bloodlines, that insanity could spread through families as reliably as hair color or eye shape, and that some legacies were destined only to terrify those who remembered them. The Crowhavens endured in stories not because people sought to glorify them, but because forgetting them seemed impossible. Their name became a shorthand for depravity, invoked whenever a child disobeyed, whenever a young woman spoke strangely, or whenever violence erupted in a nearby family. To say someone acted like a Crowhaven was to suggest they were touched by madness, that they had crossed into the realm where humanity frayed at the edges. Even generations later, the Crowhavens were not spoken of with detachment, for their tale carried with it the weight of proximity, the sense that their curse had not fully disappeared but lingered still in the land, waiting for the right moment to stir again. The blending of horror and history is what allowed their story to last. Where official records failed, oral tradition thrived, ensuring that the Crowhavens would never fade into obscurity. They became part of Alabama's darker heritage, a reminder that not all families built legacies worth admiring, that some names carried with them only warnings. It was not their achievements that made them unforgettable, but the way their madness was etched into memory, repeated across decades until the line between history and nightmare blurred completely. And so the tale of the Crowhavens persisted, not in libraries or in archives, but in the whispers of neighbors, in the superstitions of travelers, and in the fearful hearts of those who swore that the land itself still bore the mark of their insanity.